Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Adapt with Net FM podcast. This week, we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a bit of a clip show to look at how everybody has looked at experimentation this season and what are some of their favorite examples of experimentation. As you know, this season's about experimentation and adaptability. And so we look at some of our favorite examples from the season so far. Stay tuned for next week where we will have a brand new episode. But until then, stay adaptable.
What was an example of a situation where experimentation really worked well?
Gosh, I feel like every single day in the writer's room, there is experimentation. And this goes from the beginning to the end of the process. In the beginning of the process, we are just trying to think up stories. And it is almost never the case that the leader will allow someone to pitch a story and just leave it as is. Part of the reason that we insist on alternative, digressive pitching, even around an initial good idea, is that in the writing process, we go from concept to outline to script. By the time we get through the script writing process, we've written a bunch of dialogue, we've written funny lines. If we write dialogue and funny lines in a story that doesn't work, we're in trouble. So in the early stages when stories are being pitched, we're really testing them to make sure that we've got the right story. We don't want in the later stages to be re-examining the story. So experimentation is essential even at the very first stage, but this continues all the way through shooting. When you're on set shooting a comedy, what we have found is the best comedies work when there is some room for improvisation on set. So The Office, where I worked at NBC, is a mockumentary. That means it's shot like a documentary. The documentaries, the way they're typically filmed is a reality show, a form of documentary. It's shot with two cameras simultaneously. That allows you to capture, if there are two characters talking, you capture them both at the same time. That format, as it turns out, is really good for actors improvising because the actor improvising and the actor reacting are both on camera at the same time.
Love
Right?
that.
If we had just one camera and you and I are improvising, we'd get your coverage and then we'd go, what did she improvise? So I can remember what I said, and then we get mine. Okay, if you're doing two cameras at once, you can get improv. That has been super helpful for comedies. The Office, for example, is probably 15% improvised. And so that form of experimentation carries on all the way through the shooting of the episode.
I love that. And I would imagine behind the improv, there's fun happening. So we've got the structure, but we're adding a little bit of fun to that as well, which is for me, is you've created a safe environment to let people experiment.
I agree. Yes. And, fun, we tend to think of fun as trivial, but in fact, it's extremely important. After all, it's why people are watching a comedy, and maybe why they go to entertainment in general is because there's something fun about it. And the best way to ensure that fun gets into your scripts is to have a little bit of it in the creative process. And then what is fun, really? There's a there's a psychotherapist that I really admire named Esther Perel. She has a podcast.
Yes, she's awesome. Yeah.
Esther Perel talks about two different categories of human experience. One is the quest for safety and security, and the other is what she calls the realm of eros. Eros as in erotic energy.
Yep.
Erotic energy is a place where you find curiosity, playfulness, and sexual energy. All of those are energies appropriate to comedy. The original comedies, in the Greek times, were done as part of the festivals of Bacchus and were highly bawdy and were connected to fertility rituals.
Yeah.
There's a connection between comedy and sexual energy for sure. But broadly speaking, playfulness, curiosity, fun, and comedy are related. And to get into that energy is very useful to the creative process.
Yeah, I love that. And, I do a lot around the brain, and from a brain science perspective, when we create that curiosity and fun, it just allows us to bring out the best elements of ourselves. Now, I'd love an example of where you've actually seen a situation where experimentation worked really well.
Mm. Well, going back to the Olympics, I mean, I can share maybe that one and maybe a more contemporary one. But, with the Olympic Games, we had to deliver, all these sporting events across 120 venues and, back of house venues and the actual competition venues. And so what we did was we experimented for 5 years. So what we first did was, for example, I was in the Games workforce area, architecting the volunteer program and also the business owner of all the Games workforce technology. So I went and visited Barcelona. We had a delegation that went to Atlanta to watch that Games in action. So that's sort of seeing it in real life. Yeah. But then we came back and experimented. So, for example, I remember when the Easter show went to Homebush the first time, I volunteered. I volunteered to help get everyone, up and running and doing what they needed to do as a bit of a team leader to firstly see that precinct in action, because that was going to be one of the Olympic venues, but also to see how do volunteers work in an event like the Easter show. We also had test events. So for every sport and every discipline, we ran a real championship. So it might have been a national swimming meet or even an Asia Pacific meet for every sport, every discipline. So it was a real event, but we were experimenting with the Olympic, venues, protocols, technical requirements, and all those sorts of things. The other thing we did was we had a simulation. So a couple of months out from the Games, we had a military strategy company come in, and I was actually involved in setting up the main operations center where we were monitoring everything. And so what we did was we had a simulation that it was like day 5 of the Games, and we were there ready to respond to any issues. And we had, people sort of in different places around the building pretending, like I'm managing the stadium, or I'm in charge of swimming, or I'm in charge of transport. And this strategy company got them to send us issues. And so suddenly we've got an oil spill on Victoria Road, or we've got an athlete defecting. And so we had to respond as if it was real. And what happened was, we thought we were super ready, but we just needed a bit of fine tuning. And so the first 3 or 4 hours were a bit chaotic and we were a bit rattled. But once we just tweaked things a little bit, everything ran really smoothly. And then for the rest of the 60 hours, we were good. So it was a wonderful example of, you think you've got all the systems, all the processes in place, but until you actually test it for real, you won't know whether everything all hangs together. So, by Games time, we were schmick. We were very lucky. We ran the Olympics in 2000, so before, the terrible events of 2001 when security became a much bigger issue. Yes. But I think it was a real testament to the process we followed all the way through of that iterative testing. Yeah, so that's the big one. Yes. And I guess in terms of recent ones, 2 come to mind. One was an innovation project I worked with a big conglomerate in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So the team came up with this agri-tech startup idea of bringing portable cold storage units into remote areas to help farmers chill their produce so that half of it didn't get wasted. Yes. And so they had this concept of these amazing shipping containers with solar power and refrigeration. And so they started with 3. Let's get 3 in, let's get them out into, a couple of regions, let's work with the local community and test that out and then, evolve from there. Yes. So that was a great example. And then coming back to more of a typical workplace, you can do things like experiment with new ways of working, right? For example, you might say, look, we've got too many meetings, but how do we decide which ones to change? Yes. Well, one example is you delete all recurring meetings as an experiment. Let's just get rid of all of them. And then let's really challenge whether any of them are needed and only add any back in on a case-by-case basis if you can really justify it. Yeah. So that's an experiment where you're saying, well, let's experiment with getting rid of our meetings, use more contemporary channels and ways of working, maybe those short morning stand-ups instead of lots of longer meetings, and then see if we need to add any of those longer meetings back.
I love that. Love that. What was an example of a situation where experimentation really works? So something where you saw it just completely change perhaps the leaders and the organisation?
It started with me being invited into a conversation with a general in defence, and this general had been given new assignment of running a new strategic policy and planning division, with the idea of understanding how the world was changing, understanding then within that change what was the role for the military, then given that role for the military, what capabilities did we need to spend our money on? And if we spent our money on them, would it work? And so he had 4 branches set up around there. And in this conversation, he was telling me about his new organisation. And he said to me, well, Richard, I've got a feeling that if I don't intervene in some way, those 4 branches will create their own silos, their own cylinders of excellence, and they'll all spin and be completely disconnected. And he says, I feel what we need is some form of scientific overlay. And he says, and I seriously don't know what that means, that actually helps bring these and keep these 4 together as a large, organizational brain of the organization, as it were. And he said, so that's your job description if you want it.
I love
that. And so that was, and then I had the freedom for 3 years. So the first thing that was necessary, I worked with each of them to understand a little of what they did, and within each of those ran little experiments. But I won't talk so much about that, because that was little experiments to help build familiarity with experimentation, so that they were on side, right? And each of these branches was headed by a senior executive. So then the crucial one was where the money landed, right? So I worked exceptionally closely with that. And then he, who was a Navy Commodore or a 1-star admiral, then connected me with the people in his command chain. And eventually, 2 levels above me and him was the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of Defense Force. And I was sitting in front of them explaining what it was we were going to, that I had, after about 6 months, had designed a way forward. And the Secretary of Defense said to me, well, Richard, I like what you're thinking, but it's going to take at least 3 years. And if you're not up for that sort of commitment, then we're not even going to start with this. So there was the first thing. To make it successful was getting sponsorship at the very top, right? And particularly in something as impactful as strategic planning. Anyway, we got into running a whole lot of seminar war games, is what we used to call them. But it's really a bringing together a dozen or 15 people and having a conversation. We'd created 14 different scenarios, what could happen in the world, and we were less interested in whether or not they were going to be true. But if they were, what would you do? And then on the other side said, well, look, how can we spend this money? Well, we can spend that 14 different ways, but we picked 3 and then tested those 3 ways of building a defense force in each of the scenarios. So there we were, and 40 war games later, because any one doesn't tell you too much, right? You get some sense that, okay, we'd strike problems or we wouldn't, or we'd have this issue or not. But when you hear the same message after 40, then you go, there's some substance here, that we're, whatever we do, we will always need certain capabilities. And lo and behold, certain capabilities are only used in specialized conditions. And so you can get into better priority setting. And I ran that and sold that solely as an experiment. If it didn't work, we could go back to the old ways of doing strategic planning, right? And everyone was sort of happy with that, yeah. But
Love that.
in one of those, to build the executive buy-in, I ran one of the seminar war games over 3 days with all of the top 20 executives within defence. And they all participated. And the Chief of Army came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, Richard, we've looked at this problem, which was a low-level problem, I must admit, of how we provide service-assisted evacuation for, a disaster in the Pacific. But he said, frankly, we would have sent, a team away and they'd have studied for 6 months and then come back with recommendations. But here, in 2.5 days, we've covered more and we've built a confidence across the executive that, what our issues are and what remedies we would need. And we've done that in 2.5 days, not 6 months. And so that set a pattern for how strategic planning shifted within that organization, because they had long since discounted scenarios, because people were creating scenarios and then gaming them, to reverse engineer and say, of course we need this many aircraft. And so that was an example of a high-level situation of experimentation. Then that really worked. And anyone wants the write-up on that, it's in my PhD thesis as case study number 1. So go get it.
Awesome. Can you share an example of a situation where experimentation really worked and got an outcome that maybe wasn't even expected?
Yeah, Steve Blank, the American entrepreneur, famously said, "Get out of the building." And this of course, this quote, but this sentiment is where real insight is. And an example that comes to mind, Annette, is when recently working with a food business in Asia. They were looking to expand into the pet food market. And this was through being a coach on an exponential organization, an EXO corporate innovation sprint, which is specifically designed to spend 10 to 12 weeks in the sandpit or the sandbox. And what we started off doing was looking at what can we leverage? What are the underlying talents, assets, resources, networks, and so on? Because we don't want to have to start from scratch if we don't need to. What can we build on internally? And they explored global shifts in pet food production, packaging, distribution. What can AI do for pet food? Even if it's personalized pet food, what can, innovative production methods? It could be, for example, what's a meat alternative yet delivers the same nutrient value in a cost-effective way? These sorts of things. Really a tour around the world of what's possible in this space. And that, of course, sparked dozens of new product ideas. And yet, when they tested these ideas against the global market, they found that many of these ideas already existed, both by peers, existing players, and new entrants. And quite often, it's the new entrants, indeed the startups, that were very agile, very adaptable, that had really impressive innovations. And they weren't on this quite large player's radar. They just weren't within their worldview or their line of sight. And so that didn't stop them. It can be a bit deflating when we're experimenting and we're like, this is an amazing idea or initiative. And then, someone's already done that. But of course, that's gold. We want that. That's really important information or intelligence. And indeed, for them, it accelerated them. So they used these insights to refine and to leapfrog. And so they built on what was already proven elsewhere and avoided duplication, and they moved in a faster and smarter way. And so, of course, if they'd stayed inside their building, they would have missed it.
Such a great quote and a great example. Sophie, I know that at the moment there's a lot of people in Australia that are sort of struggling, how do we experiment, given there's a lot of people in fear, there's talks of recession, etc. I'm really curious, what are you seeing in Australia and how can we use that actually to expand our worldview, for argument's sake?
Australia, we are in a really fortunate position to have, we're the only industrialized nation to not enter a recession post GFC. We've had really good times, and there are so many external shifts, and yet I'm not sure if we've quite hit the tipping point. There is a lot of fear, and you can understand it. And I wonder when reality will bite, like when times will be really, really tough, where we have a lot of businesses outside of, construction, housing construction, sort of going bust. And I do feel for those leaders that have 5 or so years left in their professional lives. They've probably got personal ambitions. They've got investments, investment goals they want to reach, professional milestones that they're wanting to reach. And yet, what a wild world to wrap up your career. I mean, in 5 years' time, the world politically, the political cycles will be very different, strong economic cycles. How do they ride those waves? And in Australia, we're a very small job market. So it's not sort of the case in other parts of the world where you can just jump and move. I mean, 5 years in a large market, let's just say Europe for example, in 5 years you can move to another large corporate, for example, and have a really fantastic time in that final phase of your career. In Australia, that's harder to do. We just don't have as many opportunities. And not many leaders I speak to want to shift to, working remotely or moving to Singapore, for example. They want to stay with family. They've got their lives and their livelihoods that they're wanting to, maintain some continuity with. And yet we hear a lot in the news in Australia about productivity. We've got decreasing productivity, and it tends to focus on how do we extract more value from doing the same. And that, if you're working in those organizations, you can feel like you're the hamster on the wheel. And that, of course, doesn't lead to greater productivity. And it can feel like there's very little to play with. And so what we can see in some other parts of the world, where there might be less predictability, like it's been an environment of less predictability and higher growth opportunities, because our economy's been stable, and yet we don't have huge economic opportunities domestically. And certainly not everyone wants to expand internationally. We have quite low records of that, certainly in big business. And so we know that a way to counteract this, and those leaders that are looking to retire within 5 years, I think you're spot on, Danette, with your spotlight on experimentation. And a really key aspect in Australia, because we can also experience this island mentality where we're so far away from the world, and there are limited resources. It can be really hard right now to get big budget approval. And this spotlight on experimentation is perfect, because those leaders emerging, and particularly those established ones that are set to leave, we don't need to know it all. We do not need to know it all. Where we needed to be the expert when we had to prove ourselves as being the expert when we were rising through the ranks in the past. Now there's real power in saying, I don't know, but let's find out.
My next question was, what's an example of a situation where experimentation really worked?
Yeah. I've been digging into experimentation with, like, in beside leaders, and I think
Yes.
that actually, Yeah, there's the big grandiose experiments, but I think some of the more powerful ones are the ones that you're actually doing in your own space. So I'm actually with a lot of the chief transformation officers, CEOs that I work alongside. We're actually running little experiments on a quarterly basis where they're actually going, well, what is your intention? So,
Nice.
if you think like in the experiment language, the hypothesis is my intention to move this quarter is whatever my intention is. So that's stated intention, but then actually having life as the experiment and then seeing what actually happens. Does my stated intention happen? Did it teach me stuff that I'm actually doing further? Or did nothing really happen at all? And I think those intention doing gaps
Yes.
is a really powerful place for opening up that learning. And I've been finding that really sort of super powerful using it with trying to sort of see into those deeper questions of who am I being in there? What am I feeling in there? What am I thinking in there? And that actually has been really quite powerful because people have stated intentions that a quarter later we go, well, I had no conviction in those at all. So that was a useful experiment.
Yes.
Or maybe we've underestimated the complexity of that, and that was a useful experiment. Or actually this is really inspiring me and really lighting me up, and that also is a useful experiment. So I'm having lots of those experiments at the moment in that tight frame where we're experimenting, learning about ourselves.
Yeah. Would love an example of a situation where you really saw experimentation work really well.
Maybe almost 10 years ago, so I was working in my former company, and we had this idea that what if in the future cars can design themselves? So this was the idea that we had. And the idea was, we have all sensors on these cars. And remember, it was 10 years ago, IoT was the new thing. So what if, based on how people drive their cars, how people use their cars, we can start collecting data? And if we can, let's say, if all Toyota Corollas in the world can collect the data, we can really see how people are using their cars. So today's problem is that when a car is being produced, or when any design is being produced or manufactured, there is no loop between how people are using it into kind of the next version of that thing. So we had this idea that what if we can start closing the loop between design, use, and kind of the next version of the design. So to kind of put that in test, we partnered up with a company called Hackrod, and this was a company that was responsible for creating very bespoke custom cars. And they create cars for Need for Speed. They create cars for like Batman movies and things like that. So down in Hollywood. So we partnered up with them, and we put sensors in one of the cars that they had. It was a car that they perfected over like 30 years. And we put sensors on the car as an experiment. They put their best stunt drivers on that car. And then they start kind of testing it. So we took them to a desert, Mojave Desert, and start testing the car to its limit. We actually broke the car. But what we did in a week was we start collecting tons of data, how these stunt drivers were cornering the car, left turn, right turn, all of those. And we gathered all of those data and, created an algorithm that made sense of, using AI, made sense of those, and started creating a geometry that was really impossible for a human to do. So this was the experimentation that, I was part of, and it turned out really, really successful.
That sounds awesome. I'd love to hear an example of a situation where experimentation really worked, and what caused that to work really well.
I think the one that came to mind as soon as you said that. So back in 2012, when we were starting with Green X7, we asked that one question: why is it when we actively engage in nature, are we healthier and happier? We literally spent 3 years experimenting around those 7 tools. And now we eventually came up with that framework, which was, movement, environment, earthing, time, connection, reflection, and breath. But throughout that whole time, we were literally taking, the white papers, the science, the data. We were talking to practitioners. We were talking to the everyday person. And we literally experimented for those 3 years to really understand, okay, this is what the science says, but does that actually convert into what a practical everyday person, team, and organization can apply to their daily lives? And there was so many things that, they said, hey, this is amazing, best practice, but it would never actually work on a day-to-day basis. It was just far too long. We couldn't spend an hour doing that one thing each and every day. And so when we came up with those 7 tools, we realized that with, the little time that we already have in our very busy lives, how do I create something for an individual, a team, a leader to actually improve their well-being as quickly as possible with the most amount of benefits? And I think I'm just looking down now because I can see them on my shelf. I literally have about 12 journals. They're called Books of Dreams, Danette. And all of that has experimentation. Like if I open one now, it would literally say, on this day, I tried this. Did it work? Not great. Let's try this. So I think, just from that point of view, look, eventually it worked after 3 years. We found the magic formula. It's been amazing since. But that's one example that have worked. There's been a lot that haven't worked. I can guarantee you that.
And, what I loved about your answer there, Tim, is you asked a beautiful question. And I also loved that you captured the data as you went as part of that experiment. So, we could look at those journals and that would be so much fun. I'd love an example of a situation where you noticed or you saw that experimentation worked really well. And what do you think were the key elements of that?
I might give you an example both on a personal and professional life. So let's start with professional. Working with Deloitte, you work on a number of complex projects, right? Which is good. It sort of keeps you motivated and all. So with Deloitte, I did a 5-year stint in Qatar. And one of the projects I worked was to set up a new government entity which does food safety regulations and all. So we were called in and to help set up a new agency. There's only one food safety agency in a country, so obviously the benchmark has to be sort of seen globally. So Deloitte being a global organization, one of the advantage we had was the global reach. So what we did is we reached out to our global network, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, and US being the key benchmarks, and sort of said, okay, so how do you actually manage your food safety regulations and things like that? So we had to do a business case around the viability of Food Safety Authority. And, obviously we started with that. So we had to tap into our global networks in terms of, trying something new. Because if we said, well, we'll tell you how to set it up because we've done these, with other agencies, we had to use the live, real examples where it has worked. We had to bring in subject matter experts, from different parts of the world. And what we got out of that was an outcome that the client wanted. So we actually came up with a result that you need to have this separate independent authority because of pros and cons. Qatar as an example, there's a lot of imported food that comes into country. So there's a lot of regulations around inspections, import, the quality control, and other countries in that region have a same sort of challenges. So we reached out to the regional countries as well, just to see what they're doing and what regulations they have in place, and we were able to then sort of validate that and give it to the client. So because we had to go through this experimenting process of saying, it's not something that we've got off the shelf, we've actually we've never done this before, and we were very open. It was something that was new to us. let's bring in different ingredients and give you exactly what you. So I think that worked really well, having the global thing. On a personal level, experimenting. So as I mentioned in the intro, I came to Canberra in 1994. My wife and I, we got to a stage where we said, we've never worked outside Canberra, always lived in Canberra. I think we should try something else. So my parents were still back home in Kashmir at that time. So we wanted somewhere closer to that region. And we said, I said, let's try and look for a job in Middle East region. And I got a job in Qatar. So never worked outside Canberra, not even Sydney, Melbourne. So, we were living in this bubble where commuting from A to B is so easy. It was our comfort zone. We knew everyone, we knew the people, we knew the place. So going to a completely new country, and for me, in terms of professionally, I knew I had no contacts. I went with a clean sheet of paper, and having that worked, and learning things, how to move to a new country, how to get a new license, new house, a school for kids, and our third son was born there. So there was a lot of things that those 5 years taught us. And when we're coming back, we're like, oh, we should stay here longer, but we had to come back. Obviously kids were growing and all. So I think in that, because we came out of our comfort zone, we tried to experiment. Let's try to see what it means to live in a different country. Try going completely. I mean, it could have God forbid failed miserably. If we didn't adjust ourselves there, or kids didn't like it, but we made it work, and stars aligned, and it worked really well.
And I'd love to introduce our guest today, Dr. Paige Williams. So good to have you on our podcast today. And Paige, I'd love for you to introduce yourselves to our listeners and our viewers.
Oh, I'd love to, Danette, and thank you for having me. So I am Dr. Paige Williams, so PhD. My PhD is in organizational behavior, and what I'm really passionate about, interested in, is systems and leadership. And so the relationship between those two things, and I fundamentally believe that leaders are the pivotal point in any system to create positive change. And so my work centers on helping leaders and organizations shift from kind of being in a coping type energy to becoming intentionally adaptive, so that they move beyond just kind of performing busyness or business, and ways of working that have just become habitual, towards actually being aware and experimenting in a purposeful, safe enough to try way that's anchored in accountability. And so it's not about recklessness or randomness. It's about being curious. It's about being intentional. It's about being responsive. And it's about being able to learn in motion, because there's so much that's changing. There's complexity around us that's just going through the roof. And so I believe that when we as leaders, when we experiment well, we create the conditions for people and systems to involve kind of with integrity, intact, and evolve towards sustainable high performance rather than just speed. So that's who I am, and that's what I do.
Oh, I love it, and perfect for today's conversation. So, Dr. Paige, I would love your definition of experimentation, both in terms of leadership and also organizations.
Yeah, well, I think at its essence, it's the same thing, Danette. I think that it's about trying new ways of working, of doing, of being in order to learn. And so it's almost like, as well as the output that might come from that, it's the learning, and it's actually valuing both of those things. So at its best, as I say, it's intentional. It's not just impulsive. It's kind of contained in that it has edges and boundaries. It's not just chaotic. We're just going to try something new because we can. It's relational rather than individualistic. And what I mean by that is it's not just kind of lone wolf. I'm going to go out and I'm going to give this a go. So there's a relational, strategic And it's focused on making progress, not just achieving performance. So because of that, it stops being about knowing and controlling and starts being about kind of learning and growing and responding and building that adaptive capacity and able to respond to the changing context.
Nice.
And so that's how I define it, trying new ways of working, doing, and being in order to learn.
Love that. Great definition. So then my next question is, have you got an example of a situation where experimentation really worked?
Yeah, I do. And it's this idea, isn't it, that experimentation is actually leadership in practice. Because the lovely idea about experimentation is that it is live, that it is imperfect, that it is in motion. And so one way of thinking about it is that leadership is continually experimentation in practice, because we're never going to get it 100% right. We're always moving in one direction or another, and there's always potential for learning and growth to come from that experience. But if I give you an example from one of my clients,
Yes.
so I work with a national health retail organization. I've been working with them for nearly a decade now, which is such an honor to have that
Yes.
kind of longevity with a client and be able to see how the organization and their market and their leaders and their teams have needed to adapt, right? In a decade, they absolutely have.
Yes.
But what we were doing was we were focusing on helping leaders shift from solving people's problems for them to actually coaching ownership with them.
Nice. Yep.
And so we ran what we call micro experiments, and I have a framework in my work called the learning forward loop. That's what we were basically putting into practice. And it was about very small shifts. And the reason we have to do this is because the way our brain is wired, basically our brain is a prediction machine, right? And so what it does is it takes everything we've experienced before, both what we've done personally, but also what we've seen and experienced in the world, and it kind of builds up like a database. And then in any moment, in any experience, it's kind of drawing forward from that database and predicting what's going to happen next. And it does this in microseconds. It does it beneath our conscious awareness. And so we are actually behaving into a prediction rather than something that's actually happened. We're kind of just ahead of the moment. Now, because of that, what we need to do, our brain loves certainty because it enables that prediction process to happen with more, with more, with better results. Like our brain guesses what's going to happen and gets it right. We behave into that moment, win. Right. So when we experiment, we have to keep it small because otherwise our brains go, whoop, 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 whoop. Uncertainty, don't know what's going on here. I can't predict. And our brains don't like that. So one of the things was to create a very small kind of habit around micro experiments, the learning loop. So for 2 weeks, I asked leaders to replace their kind of automated habitual response to kind of give their team member the solution with just one question. So that was all I asked them to do. Small change, one question. And that question was, what have you already tried?
Nice.
So team member comes to them and says, no, something's going wrong, or I don't know what to do. What have you already tried? And what happened as a result was extraordinary. So the pace slowed just enough for their team members to reclaim their ownership, reclaim their agency. And leaders discovered, no, they didn't actually have to carry everything. Team members discovered that actually if they paused and thought about it, they often had the answer themselves. So belief grew. They kind of rediscovered their own capability. And the tone of conversation shifted from kind of rescuing to responsibility. Now, This wasn't a restructure. It wasn't a rewriting of job descriptions. It wasn't a cultural shift. It was simply an experiment with one question that fundamentally shifted the nature of dynamics and the nature of conversation, so that there was reflection, there were clearer expectations, there was more psychological safety, there was stronger follow through. So, like, this is the nature of experimentation, right? We're learning together. We're starting small, and then we're thinking about how did that go and what might I want to do differently next time. So framing changed everything. It really did, because when we named something as an experiment for the leaders, we gave they gave themselves permission to learn in motion and in the moment. And that meant they could let go of not getting it perfect, not being perfect in the moment, and going, okay, well, I'll just try it a little bit differently next time, because that was just an experiment.
What a great example. And, you know, so simple, but obviously you would have spent time thinking of that exact question to be able to get, you know, them changing from I need to come up with the solution to helping the other person come up with the solution. So I love
And
that example.
and so simple to say, well, what have you tried? And if the answer was nothing, well, what might you try first? And again, just that might you try first means it might not be the first and last thing you try. We might need to give even this a few iterations, but what might you try first could be a follow-up question if the response they got was, oh, I haven't tried anything.
Yeah. And I love even with that word first that you're priming them to think, oh, I actually have to come up with something first. So I
Yeah.
love that.